and what we need to do and how we need to do it, or is it about the journey that we're taking into our redemption? And how do we engage it along the way? And that's some of what I want to talk about in this workshop. So back to the future is what we're going to be looking at. So the quote that I'm going to kind of work off of is from Brennan Manning. He said, "Though lip service is paid to the gospel of grace, many Christians live as if only personal discipline and self-denial will mold the perfect me." Emphasis perfect. The emphasis is on what I do rather than what God is doing. And so the nature of what we're looking at and what we have to talk about, at least for this short period of time I have with you, is really I want to talk about the way that we go about doing this rather than the habits that we engage in. Those tempt us into a mindset of willpower and discipline. And while I'm not saying discipline is bad in any way, shape, or form, the thing to keep in mind is that oftentimes it tempts us into a mindset of thinking I can accomplish my own transformation, which is an oxymoron by definition, really. But transformation is not opposed to effort. We're called to engage this thing that's called sanctification or our spiritual transformation, but it's not a trade. So I do the effort so that then I can be transformed. It's both and that we have to contend with even as we talk about this. So I want to just get some things clarified in terms of how I want to try to chart a course about what we're talking about in terms of this. So that being said, I also want to clarify what I'm talking about with transformation. And I think most of us are familiar with Paul's words in Romans 12, when he says, "Don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of the mind." And transformation, we're engaged in moving from being conformed to being transformed. That is the journey of faith, ultimately. But what I often find, after having talked to people for 40 years in counseling, is we settle for something. And what we settle for is reformation. Because reformation is within my reach. It's built on personal effort and abilities and precision and measurement and knowing where we are. And all the building materials literally are the same. If you think about it in terms of like remodeling a house. You don't tear down the whole house. You just simply remodel the interior walls. And then you say, I have a new room. When in fact, I've just simply reformed the room. And in a lot of cases, we engage our hearts very much the same way. The thing that most people don't recognize or maybe don't even know is that the word transformed in Greek literally is the word metamorphosis. So what do you think of when you think of metamorphosis, right? Worm to butterfly. And while you might want to go the DNA route and say, well, the DNA hasn't changed, but the fundamental building blocks, the fundamental substance is transformed. It's not the same. It's entirely changed. And so when we talk about the transformation even of our heart, we have to talk about what kinds of things do I engage? What kinds of things am I cultivating is really the word I like more than trying to produce something, is what do I cultivate? Because out of that cultivation, there are certain fruit that occur that I can point to and say, that's a result of the cultivation that I've been doing. So the thing I want to talk about first and foremost is why bother doing this at all, okay? And that's what most of the symposium has been about, is what's the focal point. And if you heard the speakers last night, one person actually made the assertion that the center of history is the heart, the human heart, which really caught my attention as they were saying that. And then we went into the people that were talking today about that very thing. And Proverbs 4:23 is always at the center of what we talk about. Keep your heart with all vigilance, for from it flows the well springs of life. Well, one way that I reduce that down to it is your heart is the well, and what you do with the well matters. Now, I have a couple stories that I want to read. I know that's a little out of the ordinary because people come to not necessarily be read to, but A couple different stories to illustrate my point. And this will illustrate what I'm talking about here and why this is so important to really have a conversation about it. And it's a story that actually is entitled "The Keeper of the Spring." And it goes this way. Hopefully I won't put you asleep. The story is a tale of a quiet forest dweller who lived high above an Austrian village along the eastern slope of the Alps. The old gentleman had been hired for many years earlier by a young town councilman to clear away the debris from the pools of water up in the mountain crevices that fed the lovely spring flowing through their town. With faithful, silent regularity, he patrolled the hills, removed the leaves and branches, and wiped away the silt that would otherwise have choked and contaminated the fresh flow of water. The village soon became a popular attraction for vacationers. Graceful swans floated across the crystal clear spring. The mill wheels of various businesses located near the water turned day and night. Farmlands were naturally irrigated, and the view from the restaurants was picturesque beyond description. Years passed. One evening, the town council met for its semi-annual meeting, and as they reviewed the budget, one man's eye caught the salary figure being paid the obscure keeper of the spring. Said the keeper of the purse, "Who is the old man? Why do we keep him on year after year? No one ever sees him. Why do we keep him on? For all we know, the strange ranger of the hills is doing us no good. He isn't necessary any longer," and by unanimous vote, they dispensed with the old man's services. For several weeks, nothing changed. By early autumn, the trees began to shed their leaves. Small branches snapped off and fell into the pools, hindering the rushing flow of sparkling water. One afternoon, someone noticed a slight yellowish-brown tint in the spring. A few days later, the water was much darker. Within another week, a slimy film covered sections of the water along the banks, and a foul odor was soon detected. The mill wheels moved more slowly. Some finally ground to a halt, and swans left, as did the tourists. Clammy fingers of disease and sickness reached deeply into the village. Quickly, the embarrassed council called a special meeting. Realizing their gross error in judgment, they rehired the old keeper of the spring, and within a few weeks, the veritable river of life began to clear up. The wheels started to turn, and new life returned to the hamlet in the Alps. The punchline is this, is you are the keeper of the spring. You are the keeper of that well. And that well, as it says in the story, irrigates everything around it and makes it beautiful and invites people to be a part of it and all manner of things. So why bother doing these kinds of things that I'm going to talk to you about is it's a manner of keeping the well and caring for the well. In a lot of cases, we distract ourselves with all the downstream trash and never bother to pay attention to what's going on in the well. And that's where our heart is ultimately. So there are three different dimensions I want to talk to you about real briefly about the way of the heart. And the first of these dimensions is solitude. And solitude is not just being alone. Henry Nouwen once referred to it as the furnace of transformation. The solitude creates a context for transformation. We live in a very busy place. We live in a very noisy place. And so Nouwen is the one that said the furnace of transformation, the furnace is in which transformation takes place. And why did he choose that? Henry was very, very conscious and very intentional about the words he chose, and because he was that kind of writer, actually. And furnace is there because it is literally refining us from our false self to our true self. One of the things that I talk about in my classes, and I introduce it in one class, and then I go into a lot of depth in another one, and that is what I call the stained glass self. And that is truly the false self. It is that which we create for people to consume and safely stay behind it where people can't really hurt us. And that's the false self as well. So solitude is the furnace in which transformation takes place. And it challenges us to confront the false self we've created. So Thomas Merton makes this comment. And Thomas Merton, if you've never heard that name before, he was a priest in a monastery in Gethsemane, Pennsylvania. Yes, there is a place like that. And he's written a number of books, Seeds of Contemplation and Seven-Storied Mountain, and a variety of things on contemplation itself. And he said this before there was ever any internet. And he says, the false self is fabricated by social compulsions. And I would add just one other thing. I think you probably would too, given the context in which we're operating. The false self is fabricated by social compulsions and comparisons. And we can look at what the impact of social media has, and what's the outcome of social media has been a culture that can cancel people out and remove them from even existing in anybody's eyes at all. And so social media is the comparison point everybody ends up being connected to in one fashion or another. And it's comparing my real life with everyone else's highlight reel. And so it fuels two primary emotions that show up, and both of them are connected to the false self, okay? The first one is this, is when my false sense of self depends on what others say, anger flares up. And anger results not only toward other people in terms of what I deserve or what I've traded for, because in a lot of cases our relationships with people are built on trades. I offer you affirmation if you offer me one back. And those trades reduce us to objects and commodities rather than real people. So when Jeremy was talking about, Pierre was talking about personhood, trade is not about personhood, it's about commodities. And so the same thing is true that we have to look at. And so anger shows up not only at them, but oftentimes what I see more of, because I've been a counselor for so long, is the guns pointed at me. What is wrong with me? And the anger is pointed at me. And we've seen more and more of that. Even if you think about that, even in the short context of what we've lived through with the pandemic, and I think you all know and have heard that the suicide rate has skyrocketed. And in most circles, at least within psychology, we will say depression is anger turned inward. And so anger is the first one, and second one is greed. So when my sense of self depends on what I can acquire from other people, then greed appears. And so they get in the way. And I would suggest to you that it is the basis on which so many people, myself included, have ended up saying, I don't know what to do. I'm just never enough. And enough is a quantity. It's something I want from somebody else. It's something that I'm trying to collect enough of. Enough is a comparison word. Enough of, so that then I count. Or now I get on somebody's radar, or now I'm there. Somebody actually sees me. And you know, I can tell you from a lot of experience, there is nothing probably more profound that I've heard people say, is that I get into counseling with somebody, me in this case, and they say, I finally am seen. It's like you're surrounded by people that see you all the time. But no, it's different than that. It's being seen is a very different thing than my eyes seeing somebody. So the role of the false self plays a massive role as far as what we carry with us into solitude. And that's usually why we get this lurking concern or anxiety about going into a place and being there alone. Because for a lot of people, being alone is also experiencing their sense of emptiness. And so solitude is not a pleasant place to go in terms of what we're talking about. So why do it? Why do it at all? Without solitude, without getting pulled away from the society we're in, we stay entangled in this illusion of trading false selves. We get entangled in, this is how life works. This is how I do things. This is how I survive. I may not be entirely known, but this is good enough. This is as good as it gets. So solitude doesn't guarantee the outcome here, but it does create the context for it. And the one thing that I will kind of lay out here is it is a place of great struggle and great encounter. The great struggle is with the self I've created for people to consume. And then the great encounter is with a God that says, I'll help you replace that false self with a new one. Because one mystic, one desert father once said, God is my me. And so, and I'll loop back around to this when we get to it. But another of the desert fathers, and it's something I've been doing a lot of research in and reading, says to enter into the heart is entering into the kingdom of God. And so it's a incredibly important area of purpose, I think, more than anything. I wouldn't say study, because study is about knowing things, but purpose is about engaging things. So here's another quote that kind of underscores this. And there is a tradition in the Catholic Church where men even take the moniker of sister. Okay, that's why it's Sister John. Blows your head up a little bit, but go with it. If a man has turned his heart to God, he must first of all return to his heart from which he is so often absent. And see, we gotta, I can't change what I won't accept. And so until I get and grasp the fact that I have been absent from my heart for so long, then I probably am not going to find that kind of turning my heart, because I can't turn something I don't own. And that so much is a part of what we're talking about. So, ultimately, solitude becomes a place of conversion. And I'm not talking conversion to a life in Jesus Christ. I'm talking about where the old self dies and the new self becomes alive and is born. It is in there that we learn something about grace, actually. As the second point says, only in the context of grace can we actually face our sin. You know why? Because most of the time when we look at our sin, we face it with shame. And the last I checked, I have yet to see anybody change under the conditions of shame, ever. So only in the context of grace can we face our sin. Only in the place of healing do we dare show our wounds. How often maybe you might have a niece or a nephew or somebody and they fall and they scrape their knee. What's the first thing a kid does when they hurt themselves? They cover it, right? And then the adult comes, and then what do? Oh yeah, you can see it. So are we creating the kind of places where people feel safe enough to show their wounds? And solitude actually gives us a sense of what that's like, because we start with the great healer first. So, in the place of healing, we dare to show our wounds. Only with the single-minded attention to Christ can we give up our clinging fears and face our own true nature. See, that's why Henry used the word furnace, because things have to be kind of burned away for us to finally get to a clear understanding of who we really are, because we have overrun it with a lot of things. See, in solitude, I get rid of my scaffolding. You've seen buildings that have scaffolding on it, right? And the building isn't even revealed until the scaffolding's gone. And that same picture is here about our true self. We get rid of the scaffolding of talking friends and talking with friends and reading and books and distractions and Netflix and phones and everything else. We get rid of all of that stuff. Then what are we left with? The actual me. And now I can be met in that solitude. And that, there's a remarkable thing that comes out of that. And what the remarkable thing that comes out of that is compassion. It's compassion. Compassion is hard. because it requires an inner disposition to go with others to the place where they are weak, vulnerable, lonely, and broken. Solitude allows me to go to that place, and that also means that when I'm with others, and a few of you have heard me say this, some people haven't, you can't lead people someplace you've never been. And so if you haven't entered into that place, then you probably won't enter into that place with others. And that's the heart of compassion. Our desire to remove and fix these things, the loneliness, the brokenness, etc., prevent us from offering the greatest thing we have to offer others, and that is presence, just like God offers us his presence in our own solitude. See, that's what I again, there's some, things I say over and over again. Any of the psych students can attest to this, and I say it ad nauseum. But the whole idea here is that people don't need your profundity. They just need your presence. And that's the greatest gift we can learn to give by entering into solitude. So solitude clarifies and powers all of this for us. So solitude creates this furnace that tears away and melts away all of this stuff that I've created for other people to consume, so that I can finally enter into fully with God as who I am, all just me as me. And then out of that comes compassion for other people that feel equally as lonely and broken because of what life has done to them, or what their choices have brought them to, or whatever that is. And I go into it not to fix it, but to be present with them in it. The ancient Jewish traditions has a tradition around lament. I mean, you heard, what's her name?
Chandra?
I don't know. The last lady. But she said something that caught my attention, because I teach a class in grief and loss. And she said about lament and how badly we need it. How badly we need to know how to do it, because we don't do it. And it caught my attention, because it's like, yeah, this is speaking my language, because lament is not something we do. The tradition I'm speaking of is seen, actually, if you've read the book of Job, is seen with his friends coming from afar. All the disasters have struck Job. And what are we told his friends do when they see him? Anybody know? Well, one, they're struck silent. And then they sit down with him for 7 days and sit in silence. It's called sitting Shiva with somebody. It's sitting in the full lament of what the other person is experiencing. And that's what solitude allows us to do, is to enter in and not be overwhelmed, and to be able to be present during all of that. And solitude allows us to do that. Okay, the second one is another one that people just love to talk about. Ha ha ha, it's silence. And silence is solitude in action. So these things begin to connect up as kind of a revolving, kind of ever-changing cycle of engagement in this thing that I'm calling the way of the heart. So silence is a way to make solitude a reality. We live, as the Desert Father comments, is that I have often repented of having spoken, but never having remained silent. How often, right? We say something dumb, eat some shoe leather, say something insensitive, we apologize, but that doesn't happen with being silent. As a matter of fact, a lot of Desert Fathers were very passionate about this, because they oftentimes would be silent when other people would expect them to speak, because they figured that if I start saying something, I'm probably going to do something dumb or say something dumb. But I think we have to realize that we're living in a word-saturated world. We are in a wordy world. And you get in your car, First thing you do, turn on a podcast, turn on the radio, turn on whatever, and words are coming at us fast and furious. And to such a degree that they've lost their capacity for creative power to foster communion, to foster community, and actually to give life. So the word no longer has the capacity to create a space for us to meet because there's just so much of it. It's words that are coming out of noise. And so what do we have to do in order for words to be seen and coming out of noise? We have to make them bigger and more exaggerated and more profound coming out of noise. So there are three things that silence does for us. First of all, it reminds us that we're on a journey. Because with words, we engage the world around us, and so often we get just entangled by it. Two verses that show up in Psalms, I found this quite humorous because of the strange mind I have. I will guard my ways that I may not sin with my tongue. I will guard my mouth with a muzzle. I wonder what would happen if I walked around with a muzzle. I think I'd get a few people's attention. It's like, what are you doing? It's like, yeah, but when I take it off. And one of the more profound proverbs ever said, talk too much, too much talk leads to sin. Be sensible and keep your mouth shut. I won't add that. The words of a godly are like sterling silver. The heart of a fool is worthless. The words of the godly encourage many, but fools are destroyed by their lack of common sense. The one thing I want to bring to your attention is this word encourage. Okay? When we think of encourage, saying nice words, affirming words, etc. But something that some people may or may not know is I'm somewhat of a word nerd. And the center of the word encourage is core, C-O-U-R. Anybody know what that means? It's the same place we get the word cardia. The center of the word is heart. So to encourage is to speak to another person's heart. Not just to be nice, not to just be affirming. Those are all good. But I have to be in relationship enough with somebody to be able to speak to their heart because I see it and I understand what's going on there. So it reminds us that we're on a journey. The second thing it does is it guards the work of the Holy Spirit within us. And this is the story that is behind the steam room, if you're familiar with that, or a sauna. But when the door of the steam room is continually left open, the heat inside rapidly escapes through it. Likewise, the soul, in its desire to say many things, dissipates its remembrance of God through the door of speech, even though everything it says may be good. We're busy sharing a lot of things. And so the idea here is we are very bent on sharing everything that comes to our minds, and a lot of times it's more noise, particularly for the people around us, even in our the way we do things. So Henry Nouwen said a couple different things that I want to bring to your attention. He says, but let us at least raise the question of whether our lavish ways of sharing, now remember, this is before any of the internet, any social media, are not more compulsive than virtuous. That instead of creating community, they tend to flatten out our life together. Now again, I'll give you a window into the world of psychology, but when he uses the word compulsive, in psychology, the one thing we know irretrievably is that compulsive behavior is related to anxiety. So when I'm feeling anxious and restless, I do something to feel like I'm actually doing something. And so we speak. And that's why he's saying it. I may be saying something entirely virtuous, but if I'm saying it just to feel like I'm being helpful because I'm afraid that I might not be, or I'm anxious that I might not be, then who is it for? So another quote of his that I thought interesting: sometimes it seems that many words are more an expression of our doubt than of our faith. It is as if we are not sure that God's Holy Spirit can touch the hearts of people. We have to help him out, and with many words convince them of his power. Oh, by the way, God, you need a consultant. Let me help you out. I'll be Holy Spirit second class. I don't have to be first class. I'll be first. I'll be second. So, it not only guards the Spirit within us, it not only reminds us that we're on a journey, but it also, ironically, teaches us to speak. Words that are birthed out of silence are words of comfort, peace, and grace, because we've lived in them. If our default is to allow silence, then we will cultivate depth of words that come out of that silence. Interestingly enough, if you think about it and kind of wrap your head around this for a minute, before time, God existed in a relationship, right? It's called Trinity. But it's silent. There was nothing. And then he broke the silence to bring things into creation, to things into being with words. The words were profound because they came out of silence. Think again with me. How many years happened between the Old Testament and the New? Anybody know? 400 years. Of what? Silence. And then what showed up? The Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. Out of silence, the Word showed up and tabernacled with us, set up shop with us. So telling them what they need to know versus speaking to them what they need to hear, that's what silence does for us. It allows us to, instead of throw a ton of words at people, being careful to surmise and understand and even and catch what it is they need to hear rather than what I need to speak. Silence helps that. It accomplishes that. It potentiates that. The last one I want to mention to you is contemplation. And no, this is not just for mystics. Most people hear this word and they think, yeah, that's the desert father people and they live in caves out in the desert and that's what contemplation is and all of that sort of stuff. Well, what's interesting is the one way to understand contemplation is learning to rest in prayer. Now, a lot of times we won't connect those two things together. But just a note of interest for you, when Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 5:17, pray without ceasing, and you look at the literal translation of that without ceasing, it means to come to rest. Come to rest. I doubt that we think of rest when it comes to prayer. I mean, you've heard people described this way in church, right? They're prayer warriors. Prayer and rest go together. And contemplation is just a fancy word for being at rest before God. So, we have to make a distinction, and this was referred to a little bit last night, and maybe not as much today, but we have to make a distinction between the prayer of the mind and the prayer of the heart. Because the prayer of the mind, we have reduced prayer to speaking to God or thinking about God. The interesting thing about that is that when we start thinking about God, he becomes an object of scrutiny rather than a being to be known. It is the prayer of the mind. It is a product of our culture that prides itself in the mastery of by the intellect. And listen, I'm not using these in mutually exclusive terms. I'm not saying one's better than another. But the reality is we have bent, the balances have bent so far in one direction that even talking about the other, we get defensive about it. It's like, well, what are you talking about now? Then spiritual emotionality? No, that's an argument from the extreme. It's trying to get things back into order the way they were supposed to. The crisis of our prayer lives, of our prayer lives, is that our minds are filled with ideas of God, but our hearts are a long way away from Him. And both of these views are important. We have to hang on to both of them. But like I said, in Western culture, we've emphasized intellect and knowledge and cognitive understanding, all these things. And some of the ancient fathers actually talk about divine imagination. So, I gotta take a drink here. I'm choking. The idea of the heart hasn't entirely been distorted, particularly as it's understood in the Bible. We see it as the seat of emotionality. But rightly understood, it is the seat and the source of all physical, emotional, volitional, moral, all of that energy that's there when heart is used. That word heart is used. Our heart is the place where God dwells. And that it is also that place where Satan directs his fiercest attacks. Now, again, like I said, I had two stories. I want to read you another one. This illustrates, and I'm not going to tell you who the main character is. You'll figure it out as I go. But this illustrates, and what I want you to do as you're listening to this, and I'll cue it up for you, is to think biblically about this in light of what I just read, okay? Because if our hearts are the center of where God lives, and that is where the greatest attacks come. Okay, here's the story. I was born the son of a woodman who chopped down trees in the forest and sold the wood for a living. When I grew up, I too became a wood chopper. And after my father died, I took care of my old mother as long as she lived. And then I made up my mind that instead of living alone, I would marry so that I might not be lonely. There was one of the Munchkin girls, which tells you where this is coming from, who was so beautiful that I soon grew to love her with all my heart. We don't usually have the backstory. She, on her part, promised to marry me as soon as I could earn enough money to build a better house for her. So I set to work harder than ever, but the girl lived with an old woman who did not want her to marry anyone, for she was so lazy she wished the girl to remain with her and do the cooking and housework. So the old woman went to the Wicked Witch of the East, and promised her 2 sheep and a cow if she could prevent the marriage. Thereupon, the Wicked Witch enchanted my axe, and when I was chopping away at my best one day, for I was anxious to get the new house and my wife as soon as possible, the axe slipped off all at once and cut off my leg. This at first seemed a great misfortune. No kidding, Sherlock. For I knew a one-legged man could not do very well as a woodchopper. So I went to the tinsmith and had him make me a new leg out of tin. The leg worked very well once I was used to it. But my action angered the Wicked Witch of the East, for she had promised the old woman I should not marry the pretty Munchkin girl. When I began chopping again, my axe slipped and cut off my right leg. Again I went to the tinsmith, and again he made me a leg out of tin. After this, the enchanted axe cut off my arms, one after the other, but not being daunted, I had them replaced with tin ones. That's persistence. The Wicked Witch then made the axe slip and cut off my head. And at first I thought that was the end of me. I think we would all agree. But the tinsmith happened along and he made me a new head out of tin. Now this is where it turns. I thought I had beaten the wicked witch then, and I worked harder than ever, but I little knew how cruel my enemy could be. She thought of a new way to kill my love for the beautiful Munchkin maiden and made my axe slip again, so it cut right through my body, splitting me into two halves. Once more the tinsmith came to my help and made me a body of tin, fastening my tin arms and legs and head to it by means of joints so that I could move around as well as ever. But alas, I had now no heart, so that I lost all my love for the Munchkin girl and did not care whether I married her or not. I suppose she is still living with the old woman, waiting for me to come after her. My body shone so brightly in the sun that I felt very proud of it, and it did not matter now if my axe slipped, for it could not cut me. There was only one danger, that my joints would rust. But I kept an oil can in my cottage and took care to oil myself whenever needed. However, there came a day when I forgot to do this, and being caught in a rainstorm before I thought of the danger of my joints had rusted, I was left to stand in the woods until you came to help me. It was a terrible thing to undergo, but during the year I stood there, I had time to think that the greatest loss I had known was the loss of my heart. While I was in love, I was the happiest man on earth. But no one can love who has not a heart. And so I'm resolved to ask Oz to give me one. If he does, I will go back to the Munchkin maiden and marry her. But Dorothy and the Scarecrow had been greatly interested in the story of the Tin Man, and now they knew why he was so anxious to get a new heart. All the same, said the Scarecrow, I shall ask for brains instead of a heart, for a fool would not know what to do with a heart if he had one. I shall take the heart, returned the Tin Man, for brains do not make one happy, and happiness is the best thing in the world. The object of his love was the Munchkin maiden. The object of our love is God. And so if our enemy can attack our heart, then he also attacks our love. So the prayer of the heart moves us to that place. And it is little wonder that we experience the kinds of attacks that we do. So as I said, entering into the kingdom of God. Now the question always comes, inevitably, how? How do I do this? And usually we make it more complicated than it needs to be. But there are three things I would point you to. One, it's nurtured by short, simple prayers, not long, flowery ones. It's unceasing because it's built on relationship. And finally, it includes all of life. Now, let me illustrate, because nurtured by short, simple prayers, this particular quote kind of caught me, partly because I'm a grandfather, and I think of my grandsons. And it goes this way: when you pray, do not try to express yourself in fancy words, for often it is the simple, repetitious phrases of a little child that our Father in heaven finds most irresistible. Do not strive for verbosity, lest your mind be distracted from devotion by a search for words. My grandsons can turn my heart inside out just by uttering my name. Doesn't take any more. Such a simple, easily repeated prayer can slowly empty out our crowded interior life and create the quiet space where we can dwell with God. So what does it mean? God doesn't need a whole treatise. My spiritual director, who I quoted a little while ago, said something very simple. He said, Abba, I'm yours. Some people would say, Jesus, help me. It's very simple. I think God can handle the rest. We just figure out that we have to go into detail somehow. And it distracts us, like it says here, the verbosity that distracts us looking for a word rather than for being fully known. So, nurtured by short, simple prayers, it's unceasing because it's built on relationships. My service to somebody is part of my prayer life. The time that I spent crossing paths with people is part of my prayer life. Everything is part of this contemplating God before me. As a matter of fact, it's contemplating God in you. Because I interact with students all day long. I interact with my family members. I interact with people all the time. And I'm contemplating God himself in them. C.S. Lewis made the comment once. He said, we don't interact with ordinary people. We interact with people that bear the image of God. And it includes all of life. What is there not to talk to God about? We talk to our friends more about stuff than we do with God. And a lot of times we turn him into a fireman and talking about the fire that is going on rather than all of life that includes all of this idea of contemplation. It is resting. You know, some of the most interesting conversations I've had with my grandsons is when we're just sitting around, just doing nothing. And they just babble on, telling me everything and every little idiotic thing that they run across, a bug that they saw or whatever. And quite honestly, I'm no God, I'm no holy God set apart, but I have to keep reminding myself that I'm important enough to know the details. So, one of the things that I do, that I've been doing here for almost 12 years, I've been here 14, is I take students on a silent retreat, and it includes all three of these things. We've been doing it, well, for a while we did it once a year, and then now we're doing it twice a year. And the amazing thing, not really amazing, not surprising anymore, but the amazing thing about it is nobody teaches anything. I'm not there to teach. We're just there to present ourselves and to see what God has for us. And silence and solitude, which are linked, right? I mean, silence is allowing us to sit in the fullness of who we are before God himself. And solitude creates the context in which we do that. Then contemplation ends up happening without them even knowing it, which is perfect. They don't know they're mystics until they leave. And then suddenly they see a depth of things and interacting and seeing people on the path and everything else, and suddenly it looks different. And I'll end with this. It's a quote from my director. He said, "Never forget that we live in a God-saturated world." We'll see evidence of him when we know how to look for him. So, look at that. I'm right on the money. Any questions or anything? All right, well, that's all I got. I hope it was enjoyable and useful, and I'll see you around.
Thank you, Professor.
Yeah, you're welcome.